Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
It's good to be back. And today we're tackling a topic that feels uniquely difficult
It really does.
because it sits right at the intersection of, deeply held personal beliefs and hard, cold, structural reality.
That's the perfect way to put it. Usually when we talk about systems on this show, we're talking about algorithms or supply chains, maybe corporate governance, things that feel a little removed.
Abstract, almost.
Exactly. But today we're looking at the American church. And we aren't looking at it as a place you go on Sunday to hear a choir. We're analyzing it as a mediating institution.
And that is the key phrase for this entire deep dive, a mediating institution.
Right.
It's a structure that sits between the individual and the state. It filters information, it shapes moral frameworks, and crucially for our discussion today, it interacts with the economic and legal machinery of the country.
And the book we're using to map this territory is Woke Church, an urgent call for Christians in America to confront racism and injustice. It's written by Dr. Eric Mason.
Now, I can practically hear the collective intake of breath through the headphones.
Oh,
The word woke is in the title. In the current year, that word is less of a descriptor and more of a shrapnel grenade. You toss it into a room and the conversation usually explodes.
it's true. It's become a catch-all for anything people don't like on one side or a badge of honor on the other. It almost stops the conversation before it starts.
It really does.
But before anyone hits pause or, assumes they know what this is about, we need to clarify the mission here. This isn't a culture war episode.
Yeah.
We are not here to debate political talking points or to take a side.
Correct. We are here to do a systems analysis. We are looking at an argument that suggests Christian communities cannot remain neutral within systems that produce racialized outcomes.
Okay, say more about that. Cannot remain neutral.
The core thesis Dr. Mason presents is that institutional silence is not neutrality. In a system that already has momentum, silence functions as participation. It's a vote for system maintenance.
That distinction is huge. It's the difference between standing still on a sidewalk and standing still on a moving walkway.
That's a perfect analogy.
If the floor is moving, standing still takes you somewhere. You're participating in the movement whether you want to or not.
Exactly. And to understand where we're going with this, we really need to know who's driving. Eric Mason isn't writing this from some ivory tower, from a theoretical distance.
Oh, he's a practitioner.
He's a practitioner, he's a pastor, a theologian, operating in Philadelphia, specifically in an urban, multi-ethnic context. He is dealing with the friction of these systems. Housing, policing, education rubbing against the lives of his congregants every single day.
So this is born from on-the-ground experience. It's not just theory.
Not at all.
So let's deal with the elephant in the room. The word woke. Why use it? If you know it's going to alienate half your potential audience instantly, is it just a marketing tactic? Or is there something deeper in the etymology that he's trying to reclaim?
I think it's the latter. He actually spent a good amount of time unpacking the history of the word, and it's fascinating because the definition has just shifted so radically in the last decade.
Right.
He notes that the term was originally borrowed from Pan-Africanists and Black nationalists.
We're talking early and mid-20th century here.
Yes, and in that original context, staying woke wasn't about pronouns or corporate diversity training. It meant snapping out of a state of what he calls mental slavery.
So no longer being naive.
Precisely. It meant you were aware that the game was rigged. You understood that the systems around you were not designed for your flourishing, and you had to be alert. You had to be woke just to survive.
So it was a call to a kind of hyper-awareness of your environment.
A critical awareness? But Mason does something really interesting here. He doesn't just leave it as a socio-political term. He attempts to redeem it for a biblical context.
Yeah.
He references the New Testament, specifically a verse in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 14. Awake, O sleeper, and arise from the dead.
Ah, so he's flipping the script. He's saying, I'm taking this word, which you think means one thing, and I'm tying it to a spiritual concept of awakening.
Exactly. He's arguing that for a Christian, being woke shouldn't mean adopting a secular political platform wholesale. It means utilizing what the Bible calls the mind of Christ to be fully aware of reality.
So it's about truth.
It's about being awake to sin, not just the personal sin of lying or stealing, but the collective systemic sin of injustice. His argument is that if you claim to follow a God of truth, you simply cannot afford to be asleep to the truth of how your society functions.
Which brings us to the structure of today's analysis. We are going to look at this mediating institution, the church, through three specific lenses, which is our standard approach here.
We're calling them the three phases of the system. Phase one is system design. How did history and theology actually get constructed to support racial hierarchies? We have to look at the architecture, the blueprints.
Then phase two.
Phase two is incentives. Why do institutions so often prefer silence? What's the economic or social payout for staying quiet? What are the pressures?
And finally, phase three.
Phase three is outcomes. What are the feedback loops, things like the wealth gap or mass incarceration, that keep these inequities spinning year after year?
Design, incentives, outcomes.
Yeah.
Let's start with the design, because I think a lot of people, myself included sometimes, operate under the assumption that the church is this floating, ethereal thing that exists outside of history.
Like a cloud.
Yeah, it's a cloud that just hovers over America, untouched by the messiness on the ground.
That is a very comforting thought, but Mason would argue it's historically illiterate. He forces us to ground the institution in the dirt and the blood of American history.
And you can't talk about that without talking about slavery.
You have to start there. The formation of the American economy involved kidnapping millions of Africans, stripping their humanity, and shipping them across an ocean to build an economy based on free labor. That is the economic engine. Full stop.
We know that part from history class.
Mm-hmm.
But the systems question, the question for our deep dive is, how do you justify that? If you are a nation that claims to be founded on Christian principles, if you read a Bible which explicitly says, love your neighbor, how do you simultaneously hold a whip?
You have just identified the central system conflict. It's a software incompatibility. You cannot run chattel slavery version 1.0 and New Testament theology version 1.0 on the same hard drive without the whole system crashing.
The moral cognitive dissonance is just too high. So what do?
You patch the software.
You edit the theology.
You edit the theology. And this is where we get into something called the curse of Ham.
I've heard this reference before, usually in, hushed tones, but I've never really understood the mechanics of it. It's from the book of Genesis, right?
It is. And it's an incredibly obscure passage involving Noah after the flood and his son Ham.
Okay, walk us through it.
So the long story short is that Noah gets drunk, passes out naked in his tent. His son Ham sees him and tells his two brothers. The brothers walk in backwards to cover their father without looking. When Noah wakes up, he's furious, and he curses Ham's son Canaan to be a servant of servants.
Okay, so a strange family drama. But nowhere in that story does it mention skin color.
Nowhere.
Nowhere does it mention Africa.
Not a word.
So how did we get from Noah is mad at his grandson to it is God's will for Africans to be slaves in America? That is a massive, massive leap.
It's a leap across continents and centuries. Mason points out, and historians confirm this, that this interpretation seems to have roots with some Islamic scholars in the medieval period, but it was imported and adapted into the anthropology of American Christianity because it was so useful.
It was the theological patch, a workaround.
The perfect workaround. If you can convince yourself and your entire society that Black people are the descendants of Ham and therefore distinctively cursed by God himself to be in servitude, then slavery isn't a sin.
It's obedience.
It's obedience to a divine order. It turns the bug into a feature.
Wow.
It soothes the conscience. You aren't oppressing a human being made in God's image. You are simply managing a cursed population according to a divine decree. And Mason argues this wasn't just some fringe thinking by a few extremists.
This was the operating system.
This is the dominant theological operating system for centuries. It was preached from pulpits. It was written into commentaries. It became part of the very design of the religious institution.
And that editing process went even further than just interpretation, didn't it? In the source material, he talks about the slave Bible. That sounds like an urban legend, but it was a real physical object.
Oh, very real. It's on display in museums today. You have to understand, slave owners were initially terrified of their slaves converting to Christianity. They were right to be. They saw what happened with someone like Nat Turner.
The rebellion.
Right. Nat Turner was a Black preacher who read the Bible, saw a God who liberates the oppressed, and led a bloody rebellion that terrified the South.
Of course. Because if you read the book of Exodus, God is not on the side of the Pharaoh.
Not at all.
God is on the side of the slaves. That is a dangerous, dangerous text to put in the hands of your workforce.
It's extremely dangerous. So the institutional response was to create a compromise. Proselytizing was eventually encouraged, but only as a means of social control. And to do that, they produced Bibles with huge sections redacted. Gone. They cut out almost all of Exodus. They cut out the prophets who railed against injustice. They cut out the book of Revelation with its vision of final judgment.
And what do they leave in?
They left in the parts about servants, obey your masters. They left in the parts that could be twisted to encourage docility and submission.
So they created a safe mode version of the faith, a crippled version.
A truncated gospel. Mason calls it an edited faith. Its main message was to emphasize obedience and the afterlife, pie in the sky by and by. The subtext was clear. Your suffering now doesn't matter because you'll get a mansion in heaven, so just be quiet and work.
It totally obscures the parts of Scripture about liberation and justice in the here and now.
Completely. And this design flaw, this purposeful systemic editing, is what led directly to the divergence we still see today. The creation of the Black church and the white church as separate institutions.
Right. This is a crucial point he makes. We tend to think of the Black church and the white church as just different cultural flavors.
Right. Like, oh, I like the music at this one, or I prefer the preaching style at that one.
As if it were a choice, a preference.
But Mason argues this split wasn't a preference. It was a necessity. It was born of exclusion.
You couldn't worship together in any meaningful way if one group didn't believe the other was fully human,
right,
or was under a divine curse.
How could you? The Black church was created as a refuge, a place where the curse of Ham didn't apply. It was a place where their full humanity was affirmed, where the uncut Bible was read. Meanwhile, the white church continued to function largely within the dominant power structure.
And this continued long after slavery, through Reconstruction, through Jim Crow.
Absolutely. The institutions were set on different tracks. And this brings us to a specific historical event that Mason uses to really drive this crisis in perception home, the Tulsa Race Massacre.
Greenwood, 1921.
Most people know the headlines now, thankfully, though for a long time this history was completely buried. Black Wall Street.
An incredibly prosperous, self-sufficient Black community.
A thriving economic engine. But Mason focuses on something else. The religious ecosystem of Greenwood.
Right.
It wasn't just banks and movie theaters and shops. There were more than 24 churches, youth organizations, religious societies. It was a model of what America claimed it wanted to be. Pious, industrious, successful.
And then it was utterly destroyed. In about 18 hours, 35 city blocks burned to the ground, up to 300 people murdered.
The city government and National Guard were complicit. They deputized members of the white mob. It was a systematic destruction of Black wealth and life.
But there's a detail in the book about the churches that is just chilling.
The detail that sticks with me, yes. Almost every single Black church in Greenwood was leveled, burned, or bombed. But the First Baptist Church of North Tulsa was spared. Do you remember why?
Because the mob mistook it for a white church.
Just think about the implications of that for a second. The physical safety of a house of God depended entirely on it looking like it belonged to the oppressor. If the mob had known it was a Black sacred space, it would have been torched like all the others.
That's horrifying. But the part that truly reveals the system, the crisis in perception at work, is what happened on Sunday morning after the massacre in the white churches.
Yes. This is the moment. This is where the institutions show their programming. A local white Methodist pastor, a prominent religious leader in the community, a man who undoubtedly preached love your neighbor every single week, got up and publicly blamed the victims for the riot.
He blamed the Black community.
He claimed they brought it on themselves. He looked at 300 dead bodies, at smoldering homes and businesses, and his perception filter, his entire theological system, told him this is their fault.
And his church, Centenary Methodist, effectively became a gathering place for the Ku Klux Klan in the aftermath.
It illustrates Mason's point about system design perfectly. The institution that should have been the moral check on the violence instead became the moral legitimizer of the violence. It provided the theological cover story. It laundered the guilt.
That is just. It's heavy, but it brings us to the present. Because I can hear a listener saying, okay, that was 1921, that was the bad old days. We have the Civil Rights Act now, we have integration. Why does Mason think this system, this design is still running?
And that is the perfect transition to phase 2 of our analysis, incentives. Why does the system persist? Why is it so hard to change?
It's not just about, overt mustache-twirling hatred anymore. It's about structure.
It's about cost. Mason argues that the modern incentive structure of much of the American church is still built on silence. Confronting the system introduces cost.
And he quotes Ligon Duncan in the foreword of the book. And Duncan is a very prominent, very conservative white theologian. And what he says feels like a confession.
It is a confession. It's a remarkable moment of candor. Duncan admits that during the Civil Rights era, some of the best theological minds in his tradition, men who could parse Greek verbs in their sleep, who could explain the most complex doctrines, spent their intellectual energy figuring out how love your neighbor did not apply to racism.
That requires some serious mental gymnastics. You have to work really, really hard to exclude that.
But they did it. Why? To protect the status quo. Because if they had actually applied love your neighbor to the racial caste system of the 1960s South, it would have cost them everything.
Their jobs, their pulpits.
Their social standing, their donors, the cohesion of their congregations. It was an institutional survival instinct. The incentive was to protect the institution, not to pursue justice.
And Mason links this to a critique from even earlier, from Dietrich Bonhoeffer.
Right. Bonhoeffer, the German theologian who was eventually executed for plotting to assassinate Hitler, visited America in the 1930s. He looked at American theology and was, frankly, unimpressed.
What was his critique?
He said it was essentially religion and ethics, but without radical judgment.
Without radical judgment. Meaning it was safe, it was about being a nice person, being polite, but not about challenging the beast of the culture itself.
Exactly. It lacked the internal mechanism to critique the culture it was embedded in. It was designed to comfort, not to confront. And Mason identifies a modern symptom of this. He gives it a name. He calls it selective justice syndrome, or SJS.
SJS. I think we've all seen this. Maybe we've all done it.
SJS is the tendency for institutions and individuals to select the comfortable forms of justice. We love charity, we love the soup kitchen, we love the Christmas toy drive, the backpack drive for school kids.
It feels good. It's benevolent. It makes for a great photo op for the church website.
And it is good. Mason is clear we shouldn't stop doing it, but we stop short of the systemic issues. We celebrate giving a kid a backpack, but we don't ask why the school in that neighborhood is so underfunded that the kids need free backpacks in the first place.
Or why the parents are working 2 jobs and still can't afford basic school supplies.
Exactly. We avoid those questions because those questions feel political. Charity feels spiritual. Justice feels controversial. The incentive is to stick with charity.
And the ultimate shield, the ultimate narrative tool to protect us from that controversy is the idea of colorblindness. Now, this is tricky because for a generation, a lot of people were taught that colorblindness is the goal. I don't see race, I just see people.
Mason argues that in a racialized system, colorblindness is not a virtue, it's an anesthetic. It's a way to numb yourself to a painful reality.
How does he connect that theologically?
He links it to the imago Dei, the theological concept that all humans are made in the image of God. His point is, if I say, I don't see your color, I'm also saying, I don't see a part of how God made you. I don't see your specific cultural context, your heritage, your story.
So I'm erasing part of the image, in a way.
You're erasing their story in an attempt to make yourself comfortable. Mason argues it denies the beautiful diversity of the multinational body that God designed. But let's look at it from a systems perspective. The incentive for colorblindness is crystal clear.
It avoids what he calls the fatigue factor.
The fatigue factor. People get tired of talking about race. Congregants get defensive. They feel attacked. They say, I didn't own slaves. Why are you talking to me about this? So church leadership adopts a colorblind posture as an official or unofficial policy to keep the peace.
It prioritizes institutional stability over uncomfortable truth-telling.
The incentive structure at work.
There's one more narrative stabilizer here that I think is crucial to understand. The individualization of the problem. The idea that racism is only a sin of the heart.
This is the firewall. This is the ultimate defense mechanism of the system. If we define racism only as individual prejudice, as me personally using a racial slur or hating someone because of their skin color, then the solution is simple.
I just have to look in the mirror.
Right. I look in the mirror, I see that I don't do those things, I don't harbor that kind of hate, and I can therefore conclude that there is no problem. I'm innocent.
I'm not racist, therefore racism isn't the issue.
And that narrative was weaponized during the civil rights era. Mason points out that faculty and leaders at fundamentalist colleges would insist over and over that individual conversion was the only answer to society's ills. We just need to save more souls, and then racism will disappear.
Meanwhile, what were their institutions doing?
Meanwhile, they were actively banning Black students from their campuses. He specifically mentions Bob Jones University.
Right.
For years, they banned Black students, and later, after they were forced to admit them, they banned interracial dating. And they framed it as a religious conviction, a biblical stance.
So by focusing entirely on the sin of the heart of individuals, they immunize their own institutional structure from any critique.
Perfectly said. It allows you to feel pious, to have a personal relationship with God, while actively participating in a public system of exclusion and segregation. The perception is narrowed to only look inward, never outward, at the system itself.
Okay, so we have the design, this history of exclusion and edited theology. We have the incentives, the powerful push towards silence, stability, and individualization. Now we need to look at phase 3, outcomes. What happens when you run this software on this hardware for 400 years?
You get feedback loops, and this is the part where systems thinking is so helpful because you realize you don't need a single villain twirling a mustache to get a terrible outcome. You just need the system to keep running as it was designed.
And Mason starts with the school-to-prison pipeline.
It's a term we hear a lot, but let's look at the data he provides because it starts with perception, right in the classroom.
At a very young age.
A very young age. Research shows that Black students who are taught by white teachers are significantly less likely to be identified for gifted and talented programs than those taught by Black teachers, even when they have the exact same test scores.
That is the crisis in perception, in a nutshell. Two teachers look at the same child, the same data, and see two different things. One sees leadership potential, the other sees disruptive behavior.
And that subtle nudge, that different perception at age 7 or 8, steers a student onto a completely different track. The student perceived as disruptive gets disciplined more. They get suspended more. They're told they're a problem.
And once you're in the school disciplinary system, you are statistically much, much closer to the legal system.
It's a direct pipeline. And once you hit the legal system, well, Mason brings up the case of Meek Mill. I know. He's a famous rapper. People might roll their eyes and say, what does this have to do with anything?
But the details of his case are a textbook example of the trap.
It's the perfect case study because it's so absurd. Meek Mill was on probation for a gun charge from when he was a teenager. He was on probation for over a decade. At one point, he was sentenced to 2 to 4 years in prison. Do you know what the probation violation was?
Popping a wheelie on a dirt bike while filming a music video?
A wheelie. Now, technically, did he break a rule of his probation by leaving the county without permission? Yes. But a systems analysis has to ask, is the response proportional? And is the application of this law consistent for everyone?
And the answer was no. The case revealed deep rot in the system.
It revealed that the system was designed to entrap, not to rehabilitate. The judge was investigated. The arresting officer was on a secret list of corrupt cops. The district attorney's office later had to review and consider dropping nearly 800 cases connected to that officer and others because the corruption was so systemic.
So it wasn't one bad apple. It was the orchard.
It was the orchard. And this brings us to that incredibly powerful image Mason describes, the silent protest by Malcolm Jenkins.
The NFL player for the Philadelphia Eagles.
Right. And during the height of the anthem protests, he did something different. He didn't take a knee. He just stood in the locker room during the anthem. And then, when the media came in, he refused to answer questions. He just stood there holding up signs.
One sign had a statistic. More than 60% of people in prison are people of color.
And the other sign, the one that just cuts right to the heart of this deep dive, simply said, "You aren't listening."
You aren't listening.
That is the summary of the entire book. That is the crisis in perception. The data is there. The bodies are there. The stories are there. The disproportionate outcomes are undeniable. But the mediating institutions, the churches, the cultural leaders, they refuse to perceive it as a systemic crisis.
They interpret it as millions of individual bad choices rather than a systemic design that produces a predictable outcome.
Which leads to what Mason calls the gospel gap.
The gospel gap. What does he mean by that?
It's a disconnect. He says that in many churches, on one side, you have regeneration, the theology of getting saved, being born again, going to heaven when you die. On the other side, you have activism, social reform, which is often seen as secular or political. The gap is in the middle.
There's no bridge between personal salvation and public justice.
None. And when the church focuses only on the afterlife, it abdicates its responsibility for the conditions of the present world. It basically says, that's not our department.
And that leaves a vacuum.
A huge moral vacuum. And into that vacuum flow, things like redlining, gentrification, predatory lending, and police brutality. And they go largely unchallenged by the moral authority of the community because that authority is too busy looking at the sky, focused only on the world to come.
So we've mapped the system. And it is, frankly, bleak. The design, the incentives, the outcomes, they all seem to point toward maintaining an unequal status quo. But Mason isn't just a critic, he's a pastor. He wants a solution. He proposes a framework to try and realign these incentives.
He does. He calls it the 3 layers of justice. And I want to be clear here. For him, this isn't just a to-do list for nice people. This is a systems patch. It's an attempt to break the feedback loops we just described.
Okay, let's break them down. Layer 1 is intervening justice.
This is the emergency room. This is triage. This is stopping the bleeding. The biblical basis he uses is Isaiah 58, sharing bread with the hungry, providing shelter for the homeless.
This is what most people think of when they think of church charity, the food pantry, the coat drive.
Right, and Mason makes a really practical point here. You can't tell a hungry person to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. You can't tell a homeless person to just get a job. If you don't have an address, you can't fill out an employment application. If you haven't showered in a week because you don't have a home, you won't get hired.
So the church has to act as the safety net where the state and the market have failed.
Correct. But, and this is the critical but, if you only ever do layer 1, you haven't fixed the system. You've just managed the symptoms. You've created a permanent class of people who are dependent on your benevolence.
Which moves us to layer 2, preventative justice.
This is about stopping the cycle before it even starts.
Okay, what's an example of that?
Mason gives the example of a program in his context in Philadelphia called Bandwidth. This isn't just giving away food. This is developing career paths. This is entrepreneurial training and mentorship. It's about creating systems to keep economic energy and wealth within the community rather than it always being extracted out.
You talked a lot about housing here, too.
Housing is huge. We know that homeownership is the primary driver of generational wealth in America. We know that the system of redlining systematically prevented Black families from buying homes and building that wealth for decades. So preventative justice looks like a church partnering with banks or nonprofits to provide down payment assistance.
It's like a direct override code for a broken system. You are inserting capital back into the system to counteract the long history of extraction.
That's a great way to put it. But even that isn't enough. Because you can help one family, but the rules that created the problem are still in place. So you have to go to the source. That's layer 3. Systemic justice.
This is the one that makes people nervous. This is the political one.
It is, and he argues it's unavoidable if you're serious. Mason describes this shift as moving from being a pool where you hoard grace and resources and relationships inside your building to becoming a pipeline where you actively distribute justice out into the city structures.
So what does that look like in practice?
It looks like a coalition of churches challenging the district attorney's office on those broken probation laws that trapped Meek Mill. It looks like voter registration drives. It's about voting not just for president, but for the school board, the city council, the local judges who make decisions that affect your community every day.
It's about engaging in what he calls shalom.
Shalom, which usually gets translated as peace.
But it's so much more than that.
So much richer. The Hebrew concept is about wholeness, flourishing, completeness. It means everything in its right place, working as it was designed. And you cannot have shalom. You cannot have societal wholeness if the very laws and structures of that society are unjust.
Mason even suggests something that sounds pretty radical. A woke church think tank.
I think this is a brilliant and necessary idea, he's saying. Stop fighting these complex systemic battles with just emotion and good intentions. Fight them with intellect. Bring together the lawyers, the sociologists, the economists, the city planners, the educators in your congregation.
Use their expertise.
Analyze the policy. Draft alternative proposals. Join swords intellectually to rewrite the rules of the city.
It's a call to be savvy. It's saying don't just have a heart for the poor, have a mind for the policies that keep them poor.
That is the realignment. That is the goal. Realigning the incentives of the institution so that it becomes fundamentally invested in the structural health of the entire community, not just the spiritual comfort of its paying members.
So where does this all lead? What is the vision at the end of the road? Mason wraps up the entire book with a theological image that I found really powerful. It's from the book of Revelation.
Revelation chapter 7, verse 9. The image of the tribulation saints.
It's his picture of the end of time, of what heaven looks like.
Right. And the author of Revelation describes seeing a great multitude that no one could count. And who are they? He says they are from every nation, every tribe, every people, and every language, all standing together before the throne.
It is the ultimate diverse, multi-ethnic, multinational coalition.
And Mason's argument based on that image is devastatingly simple. If that is the future, if that is the endgame you believe you're heading toward, why on earth are you fighting so hard against it here and now?
If heaven is perfectly integrated, Why is Sunday morning still the most segregated hour in America?
He calls the current segregated system a failure of eschatology. That's a fancy theological way of saying you are bad at understanding your own story. You're misreading the ending. If you truly believe the future is unified, but your present actions maintain division, then you aren't actually living out your faith. You are living a contradiction.
He's challenging the institution to start mirroring that future reality now, to stop waiting for heaven to do the work.
And that really brings us to our final synthesis. If we look at woke church through this crisis and perception lens, what does it reveal? It reveals that belief institutions, no matter how sacred they seem, function under immense structural pressure. They are not immune to the world around them.
They respond to incentives, just like a corporation or a government agency. And the current incentive structure, in many cases, rewards stability and silence. It pays to be quiet.
But Mason is arguing for a fundamental shift in perception. He wants the church to see justice not as extra credit, not as a political side project for the really passionate members, but as absolutely central to its existence. He uses the Hebrew concepts of mishpat and hesed, justice, and loving kindness. In the Bible, these aren't optional add-ons. They are the core operating system of faith.
And he leaves the reader with a really provocative thought at the end. A warning, really. If the church refuses to wake up to these systemic realities, what happens?
Obsolescence. That is the ultimate danger. As Mason notes, if the church remains asleep, it could find itself locked out of the public discourse entirely. If you have nothing relevant or courageous to say about the most pressing pain points of your society, if you are silent on the very things that are crushing your neighbors, then society will eventually, and justifiably, stop listening to you altogether.
You risk becoming a museum of the past, rather than a living force for the future.
That is the question woke church poses. And it's a question that applies to any institution, religious or secular, that's operating in a rapidly changing world. Are you here to maintain the system as it is, or are you here to redeem it?
Well, that is a lot to process. We have gone from the hull of a slave ship to the burning blocks of Tulsa to the courtrooms of Philadelphia, all through the lens of one book, one argument.
It's a challenging journey, but I think it's one worth taking. It forces us to ask, what systems are we silent about? And is our silence, in effect, maintaining something we claim to oppose?
That really is the takeaway. I'm going to be thinking about that Malcolm Jenkins sign, "You aren't listening," for a long, long time.
Me too.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind crisis and perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer link in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.